The billionaire's fiancé humiliated the maid at the gala. Then he saw the truth. She grabbed the maid by the hair in front of 200 guests. One video, one witness, one mistake could end the maid's job, or expose a secret worth millions. Nobody understood why the fiancé hated a woman she had met only weeks ago. The maid stayed silent, but her hands were shaking, and the billionaire's eyes were burning. What the billionaire found in his fiancée's phone that night would change 3 lives forever. Welcome back, everyone, to another story about power, secrets, and the courage it takes to tell the truth. If you love stories about betrayal, quiet strength, and justice that arrives when you least expect it, you're exactly where you belong. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments, and if stories like this move you, stay close and subscribe for more. The Whitfield estate sat behind iron gates on 11 acres outside Charleston, the kind of property that made tourists slow their cars and stare. Daniel Whitfield had built his fortune in logistics software before he turned 35, the kind of quiet empire that didn't make headlines but made banks nervous when he walked in. He wasn't flashy. He wore the same 3 watches on rotation and drove a truck more often than any of his 6 cars. People who met him expected arrogance and found, instead, a man who remembered the names of everyone who worked for him. Grace Bennett had been working at the estate for 6 weeks. She was 27, quiet in the way people are quiet when they've learned that silence keeps you safe, and she moved through the enormous house like she was trying not to leave fingerprints on anything. She had a daughter, Nova, 3 years old, watched during the day by Grace's aunt 2 miles down the road. Grace didn't talk about Nova at work. She didn't talk about much at work. She folded linens, she organized the pantry with a precision that made the head housekeeper raise her eyebrows in approval, and she left every evening at exactly 6, because 6 was when she picked up her daughter. Daniel noticed her before he meant to. Not in any way he would have called attention to. He simply noticed that the flowers in the east hallway were always fresh, that his study smelled like cedar instead of dust, that someone had started leaving a glass of water by his reading chair without being asked. When he finally asked the housekeeper who'd been doing it, she told him it was the new girl, Grace. He thanked her the next morning. Grace had looked startled, like she wasn't used to being thanked, and said only, "It's my job, sir," before disappearing down the hall. Daniel's fiancée, Clare Ashford, arrived at the estate 3 days later with 4 suitcases and a moving crew, though the wedding was still 8 months away. Clare was the kind of beautiful that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. Sharp cheekbones, a laugh that carried, a way of looking at you like you were the only interesting thing in the building. Daniel had met her at a charity gala 18 months earlier. She came from old Savannah money that had thinned out considerably in the last decade, though she never mentioned that part, and Daniel, who had grown up with nothing, found her polish almost hypnotic. What Daniel didn't know, what nobody at the estate knew yet, was that Clare's family fortune wasn't thin. It was gone. The Ashford name still opened doors, but behind those doors there was nothing left. Only debt collectors Clare had learned to charm into patience, and a mother back in Savannah who called twice a week asking when the wedding would happen, because the wedding was the only thing standing between the family and total collapse. Clare's first week at the estate was pleasant enough on the surface. She complimented the house staff, brought pastries from a bakery downtown, asked Grace her name with what looked like genuine warmth. But Daniel, if he'd been paying closer attention, might have noticed that Clare's warmth toward Grace had a particular shape to it, the shape of someone taking inventory. It was on a Tuesday that things shifted. Daniel came home early and found Clare in the kitchen, standing very close to Grace, speaking in a low voice that stopped the moment he walked in. Grace's face was tight, her jaw set in the specific way people set their jaw when they're holding something back. Clare turned to Daniel with a bright smile. "I was just asking Grace about the caterer for the engagement party," Clare said. "She has excellent taste, actually. Didn't know the help around here had such refined opinions." The word help landed strangely in the room, though Daniel didn't catch it, distracted by his phone buzzing in his pocket. Grace said nothing. She excused herself and went back to the pantry, and it wasn't until she was alone among the shelves that her hands finally stopped being steady. That night, after Clare had gone up to bed, Daniel found Grace in the kitchen finishing the dishes, though it was well past her shift. "You don't have to stay this late," he said. "I don't mind, sir." "Daniel," he corrected, not for the first time. "Is everything okay? You seem—" He searched for the word. "Careful." Grace looked up at him, and for a moment something honest crossed her face before she pulled it back into professional calm. "Everything's fine, sir." "Daniel, I should get home to my daughter." He hadn't known about the daughter. Something in the way she said it, quick, protective, like she was bracing for a reaction, made him want to ask more, but he didn't. It wasn't his place. Not yet. Upstairs, Clare was not asleep. She was sitting at the edge of the bed scrolling through her phone, a string of messages from a man named Marcus, an old associate from Savannah who handled the kind of financial arrangements the Ashfords preferred not to discuss in polite company. "The wedding needs to happen on schedule," Marcus had written. "We're running out of runway. If the engagement falls apart, so does everything else." Clare typed back 3 words. "Nothing will fall apart." Then she opened a different app, one she'd installed on Grace's personal phone the week before while pretending to borrow it to check the weather, a small tracking application she'd found online, quiet, invisible, thorough. She watched a little blinking that represented Grace Bennett moving across a map of Charleston, and she smiled the way people smile when they believe they've found the thread that will unravel someone else's life to save their own. She didn't know yet exactly what she was looking for, but she knew Grace had secrets, the way some people simply know a locked door has something worth finding behind it. And Clare Ashford had built her entire adult life on knowing how to use what other people wanted to keep hidden. Downstairs, Grace drove home in the dark, checked twice in her rearview mirror for no reason she could name, and told herself it was nothing. She picked up Nova from her aunt's porch, and the little girl wrapped both arms around her neck and said, "You smell like the big house," which made Grace laugh for the first time all day. She didn't know that somewhere behind her, a woman with a $5,000 handbag was already building a case against her. She only knew that something had shifted at the Whitfield estate, and she couldn't yet say what. 3 weeks passed, and the tension in the house thickened the way humidity does before a storm. Present, undeniable, but nothing anyone could quite point to. Clare had started small. A comment here about how the household budget seemed to be disappearing faster than it should. A remark to Daniel, delivered lightly over dinner, about how some of the staff seemed unusually familiar with the guest wing, where Daniel kept a locked cabinet of his late mother's jewelry. Daniel hadn't thought much of it at first. Clare had a habit of noticing small inefficiencies. It was part of what made her good at hosting, at managing a household this size. But the comments kept coming, small and specific, always aimed in the same direction without ever naming a name outright. The engagement party was scheduled for the following Saturday, 200 guests, string quartet, the whole affair catered by a firm Clare had insisted on flying in from Atlanta. Grace had been assigned to help coordinate the household staff for the event, which meant longer hours and, increasingly, more contact with Clare, who had taken to finding reasons to be wherever Grace was working. On Thursday afternoon, Clare came to Daniel with her face arranged into careful concern. "I don't want to make a thing of this," she said, "but my grandmother's bracelet is missing. The sapphire one. I had it in my jewelry box Tuesday night, and now it's gone." Daniel frowned. "Have you checked everywhere? It could have slipped." "I checked everywhere, Daniel." Her voice cracked slightly, practiced and effective. "I don't want to accuse anyone. I really don't. But Grace was the only person in our wing yesterday besides the cleaning crew, and she was in there for almost 20 minutes. I saw her on my way out." It was true that Grace had been in the guest wing. She'd been sent there to retrieve dry cleaning for Clare, a task Clare herself had assigned. But Clare left that detail out entirely, letting the 20 minutes hang in the air like an accusation without ever technically making one. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, an unfamiliar discomfort. He liked Grace. He respected her work, her quiet competence, the way she never seemed to want anything from him beyond a fair wage and a little basic courtesy. But a missing family heirloom, days before an engagement party in front of Claire's extended family, was not a small thing. He called Grace into his study that evening. She stood near the door, hands folded in front of her, and something in her posture told him she already sensed why she'd been summoned. "Claire's bracelet is missing," he said, watching her carefully. "The sapphire one from her jewelry box. She mentioned you were in the guest wing yesterday." Grace's expression didn't crumble the way he half expected. Instead, something steady settled into her face. "I was there for 18 minutes, picking up dry cleaning Ms. Ashford asked me to collect. I didn't go near her jewelry box. I can tell you exactly what I touched. The closet door, 3 garment bags, and the doorknob." "I'm not accusing you," Daniel said quickly. "I understand that this looks like something," Grace said, and there was a tremor under her calm that told him this cost her something to say. "But I've worked in houses like this since I was 21. I know what happens to a woman like me if something like this sticks. Even if it isn't true. I would never risk my daughter's future for a bracelet." Daniel believed her. He wasn't sure why. Maybe the specificity of her account, maybe 6 weeks of watching her work without a single complaint from anyone, maybe simply the steadiness in her voice when so many people, guilty or innocent, tended to fall apart under suspicion. But belief and proof were different things. And he had no proof of anything yet. "I'll have the house searched," he said. Discreetly. "No one needs to know." "Thank you," Grace said quietly and left. What Daniel didn't know was that the bracelet wasn't lost at all. Clare had wrapped it in a silk scarf and tucked it into the lining of her own overnight bag 3 days earlier, before she'd ever mentioned it missing. She had planned this the way she planned most things. Carefully, with enough ambiguity that no one could ever prove intent, only convenient timing. What Clare also didn't know was that the estate's east hallway camera, installed the year before after a break-in scare, had a partial view of the guest wing corridor. It wasn't pointed at the room itself, but it caught the hallway, timestamps and all. Daniel remembered it that night, long after Clare had gone to bed, and pulled up the footage on his laptop with a mixture of guilt and necessity. The footage showed Grace entering the guest wing at 3:41 p.m. and leaving at 3:59 p.m., exactly as she'd said, 18 minutes. It also showed something Daniel hadn't expected. Clare herself entering the same wing at 8:15 that same morning, hours before Grace ever arrived, carrying her overnight bag, and leaving 4 minutes later without it. Daniel sat back in his chair, the study silent except for the low hum of the laptop fan. It didn't prove anything definitively. Clare had every right to be in her own wing, but the timing didn't sit easily beside her story. She'd said she noticed the bracelet missing Tuesday night. The footage showed her in that hallway Tuesday morning, before she claimed to have last seen it. He didn't confront her. Not yet. Something told him that whatever was happening in his house had roots deeper than a single missing bracelet, and he wanted to understand the shape of it before he pulled on any one thread. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark study for a long time, the first real doubt about his fiancée settling into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Downstairs, unaware that a single hallway camera had just complicated everything, Clare slept easily, already planning how she would bring the bracelet up again at the engagement party. Publicly, dramatically, in front of witnesses who would remember exactly whose fault it seemed to be. Saturday arrived wrapped in white orchids and candlelight. The Whitfield estate transformed into something out of a magazine spread. 200 guests moved through the ballroom in silk and tailored wool, champagne towers catching the chandelier light, a string quartet playing something soft enough to talk over. Grace worked the edges of the party in her staff uniform, refilling trays, directing catering traffic, trying to be invisible in the way the job required. Daniel had spent the week in a strange, careful silence, watching Clare more closely than she realized, saying nothing about the footage, waiting to see what she would do next. He didn't have to wait long. Around 9 o'clock, with the party at its peak, Clare appeared at Grace's side near the dessert table. Her voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the small cluster of guests nearby. "Grace, sweetheart, could you help me find something? I think I left my compact in the guest wing and I just realized." She paused, letting her eyes widen with theatrical discovery. "That's the same wing where my bracelet disappeared. Strange, isn't it, how you always seem to be near the things that go missing?" The nearby guests went quiet, the way people do when they sense a scene forming. Grace felt her face go hot, but she kept her voice level. "I'd be happy to help you look, Ms. Ashford." "Would you?" Clare's smile sharpened. "That's so generous of you. Considering." "Considering what?" The words left Grace before she could stop them, quiet but clear. Clare's eyes flicked around at the small audience that had gathered, drawing energy from it the way she always did. "Considering that in my experience, people who work this closely with a family's private things sometimes forget where the line is. I'm not accusing you of anything, of course. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for where my grandmother's bracelet went." A woman near the punch bowl murmured something to her husband. Someone else's phone came up, not quite pointed at the scene but close enough. Grace felt the old familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to shrink, apologize, disappear, the instinct that had protected her in a dozen households before this one. But something in her held steady this time, some thread of dignity that refused to let this become the moment that broke her. "I've never touched anything in this house that wasn't mine to touch," Grace said, quiet but unwavering. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd discuss this with Mr. Whitfield privately, rather than in front of his guests." It was the wrong thing to say in Clare's eyes, not because it was disrespectful, but because it refused to give her the reaction she wanted. Clare's hand moved before she fully decided to let it, closing around a fistful of Grace's hair, yanking her sideways with a sharp, furious motion that sent a serving tray clattering to the marble floor. "Do not speak to me like you're my equal," Clare hissed, loud enough now that the whole room turned. Grace went down to one knee, catching herself against the floor, stunned silence spreading outward from the two of them like a dropped stone in water. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera came up fully, capturing it. "Clare!" Daniel's voice cut across the ballroom as he crossed the floor in 3 long strides, pulling his fiancée back by the shoulder with more force than he'd ever used with her before. "What is wrong with you?" Clare's face shifted instantly, fury replaced by something softer, more wounded, tears rising with impressive speed. "She's been stealing from us, Daniel. I've tried to be patient, I've tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, and she just stood there disrespecting me in front of everyone." "I saw what happened," Daniel said, his voice low and hard in a way the staff had never heard from him. "Everyone here saw what happened." He knelt beside Grace, who was already pulling herself back to her feet, jaw tight, eyes wet but not falling. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine, sir," Grace said, the formal address a wall she put back up out of instinct. "Go home," Daniel said gently. "Take the rest of the night. I'll handle this." Grace nodded and walked out through the kitchen, past 200 guests who watched her go with expressions ranging from pity to discomfort to the particular blankness of people who didn't want to get involved. She made it to her car before the tears came, sitting in the dark parking area behind the estate, hands shaking on the steering wheel, replaying the moment Clare's hand closed in her hair, wondering if this was the end of the job, the reference, the fragile stability she'd built for herself and Nova. Back inside, Daniel faced Clare in the now quiet ballroom, most of the guests having drifted awkwardly toward the exits or the bar, pretending not to watch. "You will apologize to her," he said. "Tomorrow. In person." "Daniel, she disrespected me in front of everyone." "She asked you to discuss it privately," Daniel said. "That's not disrespect, Clare. That's the bare minimum of decency. And you responded by assaulting her in my house." Clare's eyes glittered, And for just a moment, something colder than hurt flickered across her face before she smoothed it away. "You're taking her side. Over mine. Over your own fiancé." "I'm taking the side of what I saw with my own eyes," Daniel said. "I've been taking your word about a lot of things, Claire. I'm starting to think that was a mistake." He didn't elaborate, and he didn't need to. Claire's face went carefully blank, the calculation behind her eyes almost visible, and somewhere in the back of the ballroom, a guest's phone finished uploading a 14-second video to social media, one that would, by morning, have 40,000 views and a caption that read, "Rich people are something else." Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with the hallway footage open on his laptop again, and this time he didn't close it after 4 minutes. He watched it 3 more times, and then he opened his email and began drafting a message to a private investigator a colleague had once recommended. Someone discreet, someone thorough. Whatever Clare Ashford was hiding, he intended to find it. The apology, when it came 2 days later, was brief and hollow, delivered in Daniel's study with him standing between them like a referee. Claire said the words, "I'm sorry for how that looked," in a way that made clear she believed the apology was for optics, not for anything she'd actually done wrong. Grace accepted it with the same professional composure she brought to everything, though Daniel noticed her hands stayed folded tightly in front of her the entire time, like she was holding herself together by force. He'd expected the apology to settle something. Instead, it seemed to settle nothing at all. Claire's behavior over the following week shifted into something quieter and more dangerous. No more public scenes, but a steady undercurrent of small cruelties that never quite crossed into anything Grace could report. Assignments that seemed designed to keep her working late. Comments about her daughter, delivered with a smile, that carried an edge Grace couldn't quite name but felt in her stomach every time. Once Claire mentioned almost idly that she'd heard childcare arrangements like Grace's. An aunt watching a toddler in an unlicensed setting could sometimes attract the wrong kind of attention from the state. It wasn't a threat. Not technically. But Grace understood exactly what it was. The private investigator, a retired detective named Walter Reyes, called Daniel on a Thursday morning with news. "You were right to look into this," he said. "Clare Ashford's family isn't just going through a rough patch. They're underwater. Her father's construction firm filed for bankruptcy protection 8 months ago. There's a lien on the family home in Savannah. And there's a man named Marcus Duval who's been in regular contact with her. Financial consultant on paper, but he's got a record for running structured investment schemes that fell apart in 2 different states." Daniel sat very still. "You're saying she needs this wedding?" "I'm saying the timeline is interesting," Reyes said carefully. "She got engaged to you 4 months after her father's bankruptcy filing became public record. I'm not telling you what that means. I'm telling you what I found." There was more. Reyes had pulled financial records that showed a pattern of debt consolidated under Claire's name over the past year, more than Daniel would have guessed, structured in a way that suggested someone with real knowledge of how to manage appearances while drowning underneath them. And there was one more thing. An $18,000 wire transfer, made from an account linked to Clare to Marcus Duval, dated 3 days after the engagement party. "Any idea what that transfer was for?" Daniel asked, though something cold was already forming in his gut. "Not yet," Reyes said. "But I'd start asking around your household staff. People notice things. Somebody in that house has probably seen something you haven't." Daniel thought immediately of Grace. Not because he suspected her of anything, but because she was the person Clare seemed most determined to destroy, and people rarely spent that much energy on someone who meant nothing. He found her in the garden the following afternoon, watering the roses along the east wall, Nova's small shoes visible through the kitchen window where she was playing under the housekeeper's watch on a rare afternoon Grace had brought her by. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. "And you can tell me if it's not my place?" Grace set down the watering can. "Of course. Has Clare ever said anything to you, asked you to do anything or told you anything that seemed strange?" Even something small. Grace was quiet for a moment, weighing something. She asked me once, about a month ago, to deliver an envelope to a man outside a coffee shop downtown. Cash, I think, from the weight of it. She said it was a birthday gift for a friend, and she didn't want to be seen carrying it herself because paparazzi sometimes followed her. Grace shook her head slightly. I didn't think much of it at the time. It seemed odd, but a lot of things in this world seem odd to me. Do you remember the man? Mid-40s, dark hair, drove a gray sedan. He called her Clare Bear when she wasn't around, joking with the barista like he knew her well. Grace hesitated. I only remember because it was strange. She told me she barely knew him. Daniel felt the pieces sliding into place, cold and clear. Marcus Duval. Cash, delivered quietly, funneled through a maid who had no reason to question a simple errand from her employer's fiancé. If Clare was running money to Duval through Grace, using her as an unwitting courier, it explained the $18,000 transfer, and it explained something worse. If anything about those transactions was illegal, Clare had positioned Grace to take the fall for it, a woman with no family money, no legal team, no safety net. Grace, he said carefully, I need you to think hard. Did she ever ask you to sign anything? Handle anything with your name attached to it? Grace's face went pale. There was a form. About 3 weeks ago. She said it was for a delivery service, that I needed to sign for a package because she was out that day. I didn't read it closely. I trusted her. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. If Clare had used Grace's signature on financial paperwork, a courier authorization, a notarized statement, anything that could later be used to distance Clare from a transaction, it wasn't just manipulation anymore. It was something that could put Grace in real legal jeopardy if any of Duval's dealings ever came under investigation. I think, Daniel said slowly, that you may have been used in something much bigger than either of us realized. I need you to trust me for a little while longer, and I need you to not sign anything else for anyone without showing me first. Grace nodded, but her eyes were wide with a fear that hadn't been there a moment ago. Not fear of losing her job anymore, but fear of something with far higher stakes. Am I in trouble? No, Daniel said, and meant it with a certainty that surprised him. But I think my fiancé might be. That evening, Clare received a text from Marcus Duval that made her blood run cold. Someone's been asking questions about the coffee shop drop. You need to handle this now, or we're both exposed. Clare sat on the edge of her bed, phone trembling slightly in her hand, and for the first time in months, felt the walls she'd built so carefully starting to crack. 2 weeks later, Daniel called a meeting in the study. Clare, Grace, and Walter Reyes, who arrived with a folder thick enough to make Clare's face lose color the moment she saw it. Daniel had debated for days whether to handle this quietly, privately, sparing everyone the public spectacle Clare herself had been so eager to create weeks earlier at the engagement party. In the end, he chose the study, not the ballroom. Not out of mercy for Clare, but out of respect for Grace, who deserved to have this resolved without an audience of strangers filming it for entertainment. I know about Marcus Duval, Daniel said once everyone was seated. I know about the bankruptcy, the debts, the wire transfers. And I know you used Grace to move money and sign documents without telling her what they were. Clare's composure, so carefully maintained for 18 months, finally began to slip. You don't understand what it's like, she said, voice tight. My family is drowning, Daniel. I did what I had to do. The wedding was going to fix everything. Marcus said if I could just get married, consolidate assets, buy us time. You used an innocent woman as cover for fraud, Daniel said, and the words landed heavier than anything he'd said in the entire conversation. You put her signature on documents she didn't understand. You accused her of theft to distract from your own actions. You put your hands on her in front of 200 people. I never meant for it to go that far. You meant every part of it, Daniel said quietly. That's what I can't forgive. Not the money. The cruelty. Reyes slid the folder across the desk. documentation of the wire transfers, the courier authorization with Grace's signature obtained under false pretenses, records connecting Duval to 2 prior fraud investigations in other states, and most damning, a recorded voicemail Duval had left on Claire's phone weeks earlier discussing how to keep the maid quiet if she starts asking questions. A voicemail Clare had never known Reyes's contact inside Duval's old investigation had already flagged. Claire's hands shook as she looked at the folder without opening it, as though the weight of what was inside had already reached her through the closed cover. What happens now? That's between you and whatever authorities Reyes shares this with, Daniel said. But it will not happen in my house, and it will not happen to Grace's name. I've already had my attorney draft a statement clearing her of any involvement, notarized and dated, in case anything from those documents ever surfaces in an investigation. Grace, who had sat silently through the entire exchange, finally spoke. I want to say something. Her voice was quiet but steady, the same steadiness that had carried her through every accusation, every insult, every moment she'd been made to feel smaller than she was. I came to work in this house because I needed to provide for my daughter. I never asked for any of this. I was kind to you because that's who I am, not because I expected anything back. And you used that kindness like it was a weakness. Claire opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I'm not looking for revenge, Grace continued. I don't need it. I just need you to understand that people like me aren't invisible. We see everything. We just don't always have the power to say something, until someone finally listens. Daniel looked at Grace with something that had been building for weeks, something he hadn't let himself name until this exact moment. Not pity, not simple respect, but a genuine, quiet admiration for a woman who had endured all of this with more grace than her name suggested and come out the other side with her dignity fully intact. The engagement ended that week, quietly, with a statement released to the small circle of society papers that had covered the party, citing irreconcilable differences, which was true enough without inviting the scrutiny a fuller explanation would have brought. Claire returned to Savannah, where the full weight of her family's financial collapse was waiting for her regardless of what happened in Charleston. Marcus Duval was picked up by federal investigators 3 months later on wire fraud charges spanning 4 states, and Claire, facing her own exposure, cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced role in the case. Not because she'd found some late redemption, but because self-preservation had always been the truest thing about her. Grace kept her job, though everything about her position at the estate shifted in the months that followed. Daniel raised her wages without being asked, enrolled Nova in a proper daycare program near the estate at his own expense, not as charity but as an acknowledgement of a debt he felt he owed her. Not for anything she'd done for him, but for everything she'd endured because of a woman he had chosen to trust too easily. 6 months later, at a much smaller, much quieter gathering. No chandeliers, no string quartet, just a handful of people who actually mattered to him. Daniel stood beside Grace in the garden where Nova liked to chase butterflies near the roses, and told her simply that he was grateful. Not for her forgiveness, which she'd given more freely than he probably deserved, but for the reminder that dignity wasn't something you needed money or a name to possess. It was something you carried, quietly, through every room that tried to make you smaller. Nova ran up between them, breathless, holding out a dandelion gone to seed. "Make a wish," she said to her mother, the way she'd seen in a cartoon once. Grace knelt down, blew the seeds into the summer air, and didn't tell her daughter what she wished for, because for the first time in a long while, she didn't need to wish for anything at all. She already had it. If you were in Grace's position, would you have stayed silent to protect your job, or spoken up no matter the cost? Tell us in the comments. If this story moved you, subscribe for more stories about truth, dignity, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. And we'll see you in the next one.